In the shadowed chambers of Europe's grand estates during the 16th and 17th centuries, childbirth for aristocratic women was far from the peaceful, intimate event it had once been. Instead, it became a performance of wealth and refinement, one centered around an object both revered and feared: the ornate birthing chair. This seemingly sophisticated device, carved with exquisite detail and polished to gleaming perfection, was meant to symbolize elite medical care and superior social standing. Yet beneath its gilded surface lay a fatal contradiction. The very emblem of privilege often placed noblewomen in mortal danger. While peasant women labored in fields, kitchens, or simple beds, free to assume positions dictated by instinct rather than decorum, the wealthy elite clung to a rigid tradition of giving birth seated upright in elaborately constructed chairs. These obstetric chairs, as male physicians proudly labeled them, were treated not as medical tools, but as status symbols. Crafted from walnut, oak, or imported fruit woods, they were adorned with velvet cushions, painted religious scenes, and family crests that turned childbirth into a spectacle of lineage and luxury. Although birthing chairs had ancient roots in Egypt, Greece, and even early medieval Europe, the Renaissance transformed them into markers of elite identity. As social hierarchies deepened and courtly culture flourished, childbirth among the nobility became increasingly ceremonial, heavily supervised, and laden with expectations. The natural, woman-centered birthing traditions of earlier centuries were steadily overshadowed by a new obsession with refinement, propriety, and medical authority. By the late 15th century, the cultural shift was unmistakable. Europe's aristocracy had begun to treat childbirth as yet another arena in which status must be displayed. Just as clothing signaled rank and architecture conveyed prestige, the birthing environment became a stage for demonstrating class superiority. The noblewoman's chamber, once a private refuge overseen by a trusted midwife, evolved into a curated environment populated by male physicians, attendants, and sometimes even spectators of influence. Within this performative arena, the birthing chair stood as a throne-like centerpiece. These chairs were far more than functional. Some cost more than a peasant family's yearly wages. Many included movable backs, padded armrests, adjustable footrests, and hidden compartments for surgical instruments, all designed to create an atmosphere of scientific sophistication. Their makers were specialized craftsmen whose reputations rivaled those of fine cabinet makers or court artists. To own a chair by a famous artisan was to announce one's refinement before the child had even entered the world. Physicians, newly empowered and eager to assert authority over childbirth, reinforced the chair's importance. Excluding women from formal medical education, male doctors positioned themselves as experts by referencing Greco-Roman texts and emerging anatomical theories.
They insisted that the upright sitting posture harnessed gravity and allowed for greater medical oversight. What they lacked in practical understanding, they compensated for with confidence and scholarly rhetoric. Their endorsements turned birthing chairs into the modern and civilized choice for the wealthy. But this medicalization of childbirth, this attempt to transform a primal event into a controlled mechanical process, ignored the lived experience of women. Traditional birthing positions, shaped by centuries of midwifery knowledge, allowed the pelvis to open and the body to shift as needed. The birthing chair did the opposite. It immobilized the laboring woman, locking her into a rigid posture that often prolonged labor, increased pain, and heightened the risk of deadly complications. Yet rejecting the chair carried social consequences that many women found unthinkable. To give birth lying down or squatting was to invite accusations of being uneducated, unfashionable, or behaving like a commoner. In aristocratic circles, where reputation held as much weight as bloodline, such a choice could tarnish one's standing for years. The birthing chair, therefore, became not just an object, but an obligation, a ritual of conformity that trapped women in a deadly paradox: choose safety and risk shame, or choose honor and risk death.
Meanwhile, the women who lacked the wealth to purchase these ornate contraptions, peasant women, servants, and laborers, often enjoyed far safer births. Free to move, squat, kneel, or lean as instinct demanded, they experienced shorter labors, fewer complications, and better survival rates. Ironically, the inferior methods of the poor were often superior in practice, while the polished tools of privilege endangered the very class that prized them. Thus, the birthing chair emerged as a chilling emblem of Renaissance society's values, a convergence of vanity, misguided science, and social performance. It elevated noblewomen to positions of honor, even as it quietly tightened the noose around their lives. In the gleaming halls of Europe, where status reigned supreme, the birthing chair became both a symbol of power and a silent executioner, proving that luxury, when wielded blindly, can be far deadlier than necessity. To understand why wealthy women in the 16th and 17th centuries willingly submitted to the perilous birthing chair, one must look beyond medicine and into the intricate psychology of status, identity, and social performance. Among Europe's aristocracy, childbirth was far from a private, intimate act. It was a cultural stage upon which lineage, power, and refinement were displayed. The birthing chamber of a noblewoman functioned as an arena of prestige, where every object, every gesture, and every decision radiated the ideals of noble life, including the choice of the birthing chair. From girlhood, aristocratic women were trained to understand their value as deeply entwined with social perception. Refinement was not merely desirable, it was mandatory. Their comportment, wardrobe, tutors, and marriages were all curated for public consumption. Childbirth, the ultimate contribution to a family's continuation,
carried even greater expectations. The birthing chair reinforced this identity. It was not simply equipment, but a symbol of elevated culture, a marker of distinction, separating nobles from the crude customs of common women who gave birth squatting or lying on straw pallets. This obsession with distinction created a psychological trap. A noblewoman who chose a more natural birthing posture risked being labeled unsophisticated or lacking virtue. To labor in a manner associated with peasants was, to many aristocratic observers, a sign of moral and social weakness. Thus, the dangerous became the dignified, while the safe was seen as vulgar. Male physicians amplified this pressure. Having only recently gained access to the birthing chamber, previously the guarded domain of midwives, these doctors wielded the authority of university learning and emerging scientific medicine. They presented the birthing chair as intellectually superior, grounded in classical texts and anatomical theory. Their advice was steeped in confidence, even though their understanding of childbirth was severely limited. For an aristocratic woman, to reject this learned authority was to challenge not just a doctor, but an entire worldview built on hierarchy, scholarship, and male expertise.
Competitive social dynamics further fueled adherence to the chair. Noble families constantly measure themselves against their rivals. If one household acquired a more elaborate, elegantly carved birthing chair, others felt compelled to match or exceed it. The pressure was not merely personal, it was familial, political, and generational. A birth performed in humble fashion could spark gossip, stain a family's reputation, or imply a lack of sophistication. Women, despite being victims of these expectations, were also enforcers of them. Courtly culture conditioned them to internalize the performance of nobility so deeply that danger became secondary to dignity. Many believed suffering in childbirth was spiritually ennobling, a sacrifice befitting their rank. Even fear of death could be eclipsed by fear of social embarrassment. Isolated from alternative childbirth practices and surrounded by symbols of rank, aristocratic women believed they were choosing the most honorable path. In truth, they were navigating a psychological landscape where prestige mattered more than survival, a tragic testament to the power of social pressure when elevated above human instinct and physical well-being. For all its ceremonious splendor, symbolism, and social performance, the 15th century aristocratic birthing chamber was a medical disaster waiting to happen. Beneath the gold embroidery and religious pageantry lay a harsh truth. The most prestigious childbirth practices were often the deadliest. What nobles considered dignified, appropriate, or refined frequently contradicted basic human anatomy, and the consequences were fatal. The most obvious problem was posture. The noble birthing chair, carved like a throne and treated as a mark of status, forced women into a semi-upright or rigid seated position. It looked elegant. It photographed well in tapestries.
It was symbolically rich, but medically it worked against the body. These chairs restricted pelvic movement, limited the mother's ability to reposition, and prevented gravity from aiding descent. Worse still, aristocratic versions had narrow, ornate armrests and decorated side panels that constrained motion even further. Midwives from peasant communities knew these limitations intuitively. Many preferred squatting, kneeling, or supported standing, all of which opened the pelvis naturally. But such practical positions were considered low, common, and inappropriate for women of status. Refinement demanded rigidity, elegance demanded stillness, and stillness, in a moment requiring flexibility, could be fatal. Another deadly factor was the environment itself. Noble birthing chambers were crowded, not with expert assistants, but with observers, relatives, ladies-in-waiting, servants, sometimes even physicians who had little hands-on knowledge of childbirth. This crowding restricted movement, increased stress, and perhaps most dangerously, hindered airflow. Tapestries, carpets, and draped canopies, all meant to signify wealth, trapped heat and humidity, turning the chamber into a warm, stagnant box. In an era before germ theory, such environments encouraged infection, even though no one understood why.
Yet the greatest danger came from the growing influence of male physicians. Their training was theoretical, based largely on medieval manuscripts and classical sources rather than lived experience. They were scholars, not practitioners. Many had never attended a birth until they entered noble courts, where prestige demanded their presence. As a result, their interventions often caused more harm than help. They favored complicated instruments, philosophical reasoning, and rigid rules about proper procedure. Meanwhile, they dismissed the practical, experiential wisdom of midwives, women who had seen hundreds of births and understood early warning signs through instinct and observation. This clash between scholarly authority and experienced practice created catastrophic delays. Physicians debated. They consulted manuscripts. They issued orders based on theory. And while they argued about humors, celestial influences, and balance, women hemorrhaged, convulsed, and died. Even after the child was delivered, the danger remained. Postpartum infection, then called childbed fever, ravaged noble households at alarming rates. Wealth amplified the risk. The layers of fabric, the crowded rooms, the ceremonial washing rituals performed with contaminated water, all contributed to deadly outbreaks. Many noble women survived childbirth only to die days later, fevered and delirious, while courtiers whispered about omens instead of sanitation. In the end, the prestige of the noble birthing chamber masked a grim anatomical truth. The human body needed flexibility, movement, fresh air, and practical expertise. Instead, aristocratic women were given hierarchy, symbolism, and scholarly interference, and they paid for it with their lives.
For centuries, the noble birthing chamber stood as a symbol of prestige, an elaborately decorated stage on which a family's wealth, lineage, and social position were displayed. Every tapestry, every candle, every silken drape reinforced the idea that childbirth among the elite was not a private event, but a public performance of status. Yet, by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, that very symbolism, the dense fabrics, the crowds of observers, the rituals shaped by astrology and ceremony began to collapse under the weight of its own consequences. What had once been a badge of honor slowly revealed itself to be a silent agent of death. The shift was not sudden. It moved like a slow tide, pushed by rising scientific curiosity, increasing skepticism of medieval medicine, and the tragic frequency of noble women dying in childbirth. Families who once boasted of their richly decorated birthing rooms could no longer ignore that these same rooms had buried their daughters, sisters, and wives. The rituals meant to protect them, closing windows, stuffing the room with attendants, limiting movement, and insisting on layers of heavy begging, became harder to justify as mortality continued its quiet, ruthless march. The decline began at the edges of society. In towns and rural communities, midwives had long practiced forms of hygiene and open-air birthing that, though based on intuition rather than science, provided far better outcomes. These methods stood in stark contrast to elite traditions where the weight of symbolism held stronger than the weight of experience. Slowly, whispered comparisons started to circulate. Why, people wondered, did poorer women often survive childbirth more frequently than noble women surrounded by luxury? By the early Enlightenment, a new world of ideas was forming. Anatomists began studying the human body, not as a vessel governed by the stars, but as a system governed by structure and cause. Physicians, though still imperfect and often resistant to change, gradually adopted more empirical approaches. Cleanliness, airflow, and the natural movement of the body. Concepts once considered disruptive to ritual became topics of serious discussion. The rise of lying-in hospitals in the 18th century revealed another painful truth. When traditions of noble rooms were replicated institutionally, mortality surged. Childbed fever ravaged these early facilities, proving that the rituals had never been protective. They had simply been contained within wealthy homes. Now the problem spread into public view, the illusion shattered. Over time, noble families began to abandon the suffocating pageantry of childbirth. Rooms grew simpler. Crowds were dismissed. Midwives regained respect, and physicians were forced, often reluctantly, to reconsider centuries of scholarly arrogance. Change was uneven and slow, but it was irreversible. By the 19th century, germ theory would finally explain the tragedy that had haunted noble households for generations. What had once been a status symbol was exposed as a fatal misunderstanding. The luxurious rooms, the heavy drapes, the ceremonial crowds, none were signs of power. They were signs of vulnerability disguised as tradition. Thus, the noble birthing chamber did not end suddenly. but quietly. Not with a revolution, but with a long, reluctant acknowledgement beauty had never meant safety, and tradition had never meant survival.